Hey everyone, welcome to Conjure-sations 2. Great name, I know. I'm here with Evan. We spoke in the first episode on kind of ethics and an overview of what I'm trying to accomplish here. So if you haven't watched that, please go because we'll be continuing on. Um, in that, we discussed kind of an overview of Conjure, the high level and low level of what I'm kind of hoping to achieve. And I'm just wondering, Evan, if you have any words to say or a critique on the way I'm approaching what I'm trying to accomplish.
Honestly, critique of the overall project. I actually really like what you're trying to do and how you're trying to go about it. I mean, I could make the classic technical digs at JavaScript or something like that, or go for the sort of economic accessibility angle of I noticed that Conjure was running like at say 15 frames a second roughly on a professional grade GPU in my laptop that came out 2 or 3 years ago. And so but it's obviously a work in progress in what I would consider to be a sort of alpha or pre-alpha stage of development. So I'm not sure how relevant those critiques are, honestly. You know, I'm curious to also hear your thoughts. Since we did go into ethics a bit in that last conversation, there's obviously some sort of ethical factors that come into play when we talk about, say, the spatial web, Web 3.0, whatever you want to call this sort of nascent emerging space. And I think that some as well of the sort of ethical complications of what we've seen in the blockchain space will probably transfer over into this project unless they're addressed as well. So I'm curious as to what you've specifically thought of as that relates to Conjure, those two sort of lines of critique, and see where your thinking is currently on this.
Mm, yeah. So I kind of view this as a stack of different layers of where ethics has a, a necessity. So at the kind of the low level, the decentralization, the peer-to-peer networking, the technical level, kind of that I see as having a lot more work done already. In the way that blockchains use gossip to verify and come to consensus. Holochain is also kind of basing their entire model on this, and I think at that level, things are actually quite necessary because it's testable. The next level up would be kind of the actual interaction space. So peers talking to peers, and the way that we have what we mentioned last time, a protocol for interfacing between different cultures, between different people. I think that hasn't had nearly as much effort put into it, and that seems to be the next step, actually developing discernment and having a way to actually develop capacity both within the program and outside of kind of the entering into these spaces. And then the layer on top of that would be the actual collective intelligence, the actual emergent properties, new economic models, markets that emerge, all that sort of stuff. In terms of what thought I've done into this, I mean, I don't know what thought you can do into this, really. You kind of have to just enter into it and figure it out as you go, trying to be as grounded and collaborative as possible.
Yeah, totally agree on that point, and I like your multi-layer model of the considerations here. That seems like a really good way to think about it. So, I guess I want to pivot slightly then with another question or potential, I guess you could say, critique. So, I found it really interesting to watch the Ethereum blockchain as it was evolving. I was on the early test nets for that, and then just seeing what happened in that space, and then leading up to what's often called the DAO hack and the resulting forking of the Ethereum blockchain, right? So now I personally have some kind of mixed feelings about this, but I think the side that I come down on the strongest is that the language there was that the code was the contract, right? And somebody did something which was implemented without altering the code. So in other words, it was within the scope of that contract. And then, so essentially, to me, that makes everyone who participated in that fork a bad faith actor, right? Now you can also take a slightly more zoomed out view and say, okay, this was just an early level attempt and so on. But to me, that completely destroyed any trust that I had in the Ethereum network as a whole. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on ideas like the code is the contract, sort of machine implementable or machine readable contractual systems in general, whether DAOs or other efforts in that area, and to what extent human judgment or collective judgment should be allowed to override the language of the contract, so to speak, in these cases.
Yeah. What we spoke about last time was the notion of using smart contracts to essentially limit the functionality and optimization that machine learning algorithms can have. And I think that actually goes the other way as well, using machine learning, using these technologies to actually limit the degree to which these contracts are the things that actually govern us. And having this emerge as an ecosystem is the only way that I've actually been able to conceptualize a coherent narrative to how things can progress forward in a way that's not self-destructive. There's a lot there. I think thinking about things in terms of complexity is always good, because what we've essentially created with these smart contracts are complicated systems, and we're trying to apply them to complex things like literal economic models with the crypto stuff, and more broadly into automation and AI. It's not provable in the domain of the complex. You actually have to have these things emerge for there to be any coherency into the domain of the complex. So I think my model of using AI, using the Internet of Things, using smart contracts, all in a way to create a new synthesis is like the only way I see this actually happening, and the only way that it actually scales as well. I can say more on that if you'd like.
Well, what I want to double click on here is a part of the initial question, which has to do with essentially, when is it appropriate to use collective human judgment to void the results of a smart contract?
Ooh, now I wish I've done we could have done a ethics 101 before this. I mean, I think my answer is...
I'm not trying to put you on the spot so hard. This to me is one of the central questions that crystallizes around this space, because you get very different answers from people who otherwise seem to have rough ethical consonance or harmony between their views, and to be sophisticated and good faith actors in the world. And so to me, I don't have a predetermined answer here that I'm looking to see, oh, is Josh going to say the right thing here? I'm really just like, this is a space that's kind of on the edge for me too, that I'm just trying to explore, just for the record.
Yeah, totally. My answer would be, instead of asking why or what, I would ask how. How do we actually interface with these systems? Because we don't speak ones and zeros. We don't speak in terms of functions and interactions. We speak in terms of narrative and feelings. So how can we, create an embodied sense of these systems, what I call conjuring hyper objects, which is why Conjure has the name Conjure.
Yeah, I love that.
And also, then what does that built sense give rise to? What does the actual feeling and the actual connection we have with technology look like when we are embedded in a extended reality or mixed reality, augmented reality sort of system? And that's why I see AR being part of the solution, because if we're going to put all these systems into place in the world, we need a way to actually understand how they're operating. So I don't have an answer for why or what, but I have an answer for how we might go about exploring these things.
Okay, yeah. So to go a little deeper into that, then, so I think one of the ways that I see sort of that this whole situation with the DAO and the Ethereum blockchain, why it came to what it came to, in part had to do with the fact that the only option was the nuclear option due to the immutability of blockchains in this sense, right? Either the hack happened or it didn't. And so that relies on a bunch of humans coming to consensus in a space which is not the Ethereum blockchain and deciding whether or not to, switch their client over to a new blockchain or not, essentially, right? Or a new fork of the blockchain. So that's sort of a nuclear option there, right? We're either going to erase the past or we're not. And, this case was pretty obvious because there was so much money involved, right? But I'm thinking especially of the potential for, let's say that someone encodes compromising information about someone else, essentially blackmail material, right, into the blockchain. There's any number of services that allow you to encode arbitrary information and preserve it on a blockchain, right? So it seems that if you were high enough profile and influential enough in reality and the real world, you might be able to cause such a blockchain fork there, right, to happen, to censor that information. But if it's just a random person like you or me, well, we're probably screwed there. And maybe we should be, maybe we shouldn't be. But I'm especially interested in how we can apply sort of even ethical standards up and down the scale of how much, say, power and influence people have in the embodied human meat space economy.
So where mine,
this has been, just to kind of clarify just a second where I'm going with this, this has been a perennial issue faced by sort of techno-utopian dream projects since the very beginning of the internet, has been the power that can be wielded by human beings in the world, that regardless of what the contracts say, regardless of what the protocol states in its official documentation, that behavior can be altered if sufficiently powerful people or groups of people in the real world of political and corporate actors decide that it should or must be.
Yeah, so the notion of power, I think, is most important there. And something I am increasingly aware of is the notion of power asymmetries, the commons, commoning, and indigenous notions. So yeah, my opinion on the blockchain stuff is that the blockchains are inherently centralized because they all must run the same code. If you think about culture space, we don't all run the same code. We run the same code in our DNA, but even that changes depending on our geography. So there is, to beat a dead horse, I think interoperability and different systems interacting, a protocol for interfacing is where these solutions arise from.
Right. Okay. So I'm hearing something like the fact that there are many different Python runtimes, for example, right? And they all can execute Python code that conforms to the standard, but they have very different backend implementations of that. Some of them are bootstrapped in Python, some of them are in C. There's all kinds of weird other Python runtimes that exist, or you could roll your own, right? So that's the sort of thing you're pointing to as a sort of federated architecture where the protocol is defined, but the implementations are left up to any number of independent implementers, essentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And we're not operating at the level of ones and zeros of code. We're actually operating at the level of functionality and provability. We're talking about smart contracts specifically.
Right.
And AI might be a component of how we actually are able to synthesize these protocols. That to me feels like an aspect of how we go about doing this, where we have essentially our own, for each different context, we have our own algorithms that can essentially interpret the language we're using in function space and culture space, and be able to interface with that in the same way that Neuralink proposes that we interface the brain with AI using that technology. That's how we can interface with the virtual world in that space.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, and that actually solves an interesting problem there too in terms of vulnerability protection, because if there's not one standardized code implementation on the back end, so to speak, on the individual user or service's computer, then you're not going to have, say, the situation you have now with like iPhone 0 days, where they're incredibly valuable and coveted, and a ton of research goes into producing them for various bad actors. Because if you have one, now everybody with an iPhone can be owned, right? So as opposed to that, you would have a multiplicity of different architectures. I think this is kind of part of how, say, in natural ecosystems, humans and other species, say even with COVID right now, there are vastly varying levels of severity of this disease based on human biological and genetic differences and epigenetic differences, right? So it gives us some sort of chance, right, to resist a sort of universally flattening plague. Well, same thing kind of would apply to this virtual ecosystem based on what you're saying.
Totally. So it seems like any point of fragility proves centralization, and any point of decentralization leads to increased anti-fragility.
Right.
Yeah. Something we spoke about in the last episode was you brought up a potential problem with the open source model, and I'd like to kind of double click on that and just elaborate.
Sounds good. Remind me of the problem I brought up last time.
Yeah, I was hoping you would remember. I think it was to do with competing against kind of the big companies, and also how you manage such open systems when they are not bound to stakeholders. But I might be wrong. I'm not quite
sure.
Okay,
so that suggests some interesting directions we could go. I'm not sure if these will be exactly the same as in the last conversation, but yeah, so one element of that, the first part, is of course the dynamic whereby, say, the Linux kernel, a wonderful example of human collaboration done in a sort of gift economy style, right? I mean, almost no one for a long time was paid for their work there. And even now, most people who are working on Linux in general that's not their day job, right? It's very cool what's happening there. And yet, most of the profits that have accrued economically because of the existence of the Linux kernel have not actually gone to those people who created it. And even say you have, Linus and some of the other real high-level kernel maintainers have gotten nice, lucrative jobs at big tech companies. But again, even if they're getting paid $20 million a year, that's still a tiny, tiny fraction of the value that this kernel has created for companies like IBM, Google, Microsoft, even now with Azure and Oracle, and the list goes on, right? So that sort of both open source seems to have dealt with the sort of credit allocation issue, in the sense that the GNU licenses have had some issues with defensibility in court, but by and large have held up at least decently, such that nobody's really confused about who contributes to Linux. But the sort of economic credit allocation, in the sense of financial remuneration, is quite an unsolved problem in that space, I think. And it relies right now, like, one way to look at it would be that you could view the open source community in general, the Linux community in particular, as a sort of proto-B, to use Jim Rutt's term here, right? I think in certain senses it could be viewed as that. And yet, it very much is in the stage of essentially parasitizing game A, and that in order to have the equipment and the technical expertise and just the roof over your head that you need to be able to meaningfully contribute open source projects, you likely need to either be, well, independently wealthy or with independently wealthy parents, or you probably have a job in the tech sector working for a more or less major player. And that gives you the financial freedom to be able to spend a lot of your spare time, and if you're lucky, even some of your work time, contributing to open source efforts. So it would be very cool, though, if, say, the proportions were flipped of the people who are big contributors to the major open source projects. Now, most of them work for big for-profit tech companies, and a few of them work for smaller nonprofit setups like Mozilla or various other free software nonprofits. I'd like to see the proportions there reversed. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we can use, say, maybe things like blockchain, Web 3.0, these sorts of technologies that you've been exploring to solve some of the hard problems inherent to that, and get the ability for people who are genuinely contributing to society in this way to receive enough compensation for that they can do this thing full time.
It's a tough problem, because trying to essentially discretize the value that actually is created is, in some sense, unethical. How do you place value on something that doesn't actually have a metric? So we either need to create metrics or find ways of measuring value as it is used. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's tough. So one way I'm exploring with Conjure is to actually create a marketplace, or a different paradigm for a marketplace for the tooling system, where users are essentially creating tools and building on other tools. So essentially like the open source idea, where you have a bunch of packages and you have packages built on those packages, and you keep building them up into more and more complex and specific use cases. If you can have a way of trickling money back down, so that the more value someone creates, the more credit is accrued to them. I mean, I haven't done much thinking in this space. I think because there are so many potential ways of going about this with crypto. Brave tokens allow you to essentially pay people just for the things they do. GitHub is quite integrated with that. I'm not sure I have a good answer. I think thinking in terms of the power hierarchies and returning to a commons where, I mean, UBI is interesting as well. What does UBI look like in the context of contributing to open source?
That's exactly, in essence, where I'm hoping to go with this. And what I mean by that is, of course, if we had a sort of, global, or even, say, in my country, in the United States, like a federal level UBI, such that someone could have a small, humble apartment, afford a used PC, and a relatively decent internet connection, then they could be an open source contributor full time, be doing valuable things in the world, and not worry about becoming homeless, right? But of course, we have no such thing here in the US and in most countries in the world. And to me, this is one of the big tragedies of humanity in the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st century. Buckminster Fuller quite aptly pointed out close to 75 years ago now that we have the level of technology and resource extraction and automation capabilities that the vast majority of the population does not, in fact, need to work for 8 hours a day in order to keep society running. COVID has been quite a case in point with that, right? And then, you have David Graeber's work on the phenomenon of bullshit jobs, and what a shockingly high percentage of jobs, even the people who do them don't really believe is contributing any meaningful value to their company or to society. So that's obviously a huge issue. And I do think something like a UBI, whether implemented at a current like state level government scale, or whether implemented through these emerging disruptive technologies like crypto, would be something that would be a great boon to humanity in general, because it just makes me sad to think of all of the wasted talent out there, essentially. What I mean by this is I continue to meet people through the STOA, through other adjacent spaces that are where we're having these some of these conversations, and it's like these are just utterly brilliant people who have great minds, some technical, some more philosophical, some almost polymathic in their sphere of interests and skills. And how many of those people are engaged in economic activity to keep themselves afloat that in no way takes advantage of their capabilities and interests and real capacity to contribute. This is a huge problem, and I agree we're not going to solve it in this conversation, but it is important to note. And so unless you wanted to stay on that topic longer, I did find it interesting to pivot to a sort of different angle of some issues or things we can look at in the current open source ecosystem and try to problematize or think about how we can avoid some of these failure modes. And this is something you'll probably be familiar with. Are you familiar with the infamous left pad incident in the JavaScript world?
Yep.
Yeah. So this is something that was a complete disaster, right? Broke Node and God knows how many other major projects because some random developer had written a simple 8-line left pad function and decided to take their GitHub down. So now none of these projects can build until everybody had to rush around and fix that. And it's sort of ridiculous to have an external dependency for such a tiny bit of functionality. And this sort of seems to run counter to the philosophy that you were espousing earlier of having defined protocols, but having many independent implementations. So I wonder your thoughts about that and ways to discourage, perhaps incentive-wise, reliance on a single, I don't know how to language this. It's not part of a standard library, but it was a de facto standard function in all these JavaScript projects. How do we deal with that dynamic, essentially, is an interesting open question for me as well.
Well, I see three points there. The first being immutability. If packages and releases are immutable, this could not have happened. Obviously, you've got storage and actually being able to reference those things. But if the taking down of the GitHub meant that the code didn't actually disappear from the world, this wouldn't be an issue.
That's correct, yeah.
That's the first thing. The second thing is reducibility. So programming comes in a few different paradigms, and not all of them are reducible to single functions. Functional programming and pure functional programming is the idea that you can essentially reduce complicated functions into whole programs into a single function that just runs. Am I correct in that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say it has to do with the notion of functional programming. To me, pure functional programming, at least the way that I tend to relate to it, is the emphasis on functions without side effects that don't change mutable state, right? And that seems to be what you're pointing to here as well. The idea that because you decompose your program, not necessarily into a single function, but you decompose it into some set of functions where these functions can be chained together. And especially important is the idea that any functions that mutate global state can then be sort of cordoned off from the rest of the purely functional code. Haskell's really good at this, for example, at encouraging this sort of design paradigm. Other functional languages like Lisp are this is less built into the structure of the language for Lisp, but it's obviously possible to implement in that ecosystem as well. So yeah, I'm a big fan of this sort of pure functional programming paradigm where it's very clearly noted when a given function is going to step outside the paradigm of immutable state, reproducibility. You execute the same function with the same inputs an arbitrary number of times. It should always return the same value unless it's very clearly marked as influencing mutable global state, right?
Yeah, and so being able to delineate that difference, I think, for extremely abstract notions like machine learning and smart contracts may be necessary to actually have provability in the emerging spatial web. The third thing that I'm looking at for Conjure is using a content-addressed system for storing immutable tools, essentially. And IPFS does this discreetly, where rather than referencing based on location or the specific implementation of something, you're referencing something based on the actual content of the file. And so using this solves essentially the two previous problems, at least in the closed ecosystem of Conjure. If you can create a pure functional tool, and if you can make it immutable, this problem is, at least in my mind, solved.
Yeah, this reminds me a lot of the approach to reproducible builds and environments that places like Nix are taking with NixOS and GUIX and similar like declarative or functional reproducible deterministic Linux distributions and builds and so on, right? So that's kind of where you're going with this?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I really enjoyed seeing the progress on that front, and I do think it's a great way to attack this problem. Have your descriptors, in your database essentially being some sort of high resolution enough hash of the actual contents that you're not going to have collisions. Then you can refer to it by that hash and always grab the same version, essentially, right?
Yep. That's correct. Let's pivot to something semi-related. A project that I've now kind of put on the back burner, but still as a sub-project of Conjure, Reverse Incentive, which is essentially a project mapping, creating a protocol for mapping relationships between systems and subsystems, essentially a way to map out interactions and systems. My idea is that if we want to conjure hyperobjects, we need a way to actually see the relationships and be able to provably go about both simulating but exploring how systems interact. I mean, I've just said the same thing 3 times there. I want to get your thoughts on the degree to which you think that actually is something that might have utility in the broader sense. If we are barking up the wrong tree by trying to actually reduce the complex world into functions, and if we are trying to actually design systems, is there utility in trying to map out kind of the way the world works and see if we can have attack vectors to change incentives, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think there is great utility in trying. I want to say that first. Now, whether or not this effort will succeed or even is possible in principle to succeed, I'm much less sure about. But when you look at the history of our attempts to do so with the natural world already, right? Our attempts to systematize our understanding and decompose the elements of natural ecosystems into smaller, more understandable functional descriptions, which has been a large part of the study of things like biochemistry, biology, ecology, and all of the related fields of systems dynamics, which have come out of that study, has paid huge dividends in our understanding of the natural world, right? And so even if we can't completely describe it at the level that you're describing as desirable here, we've still gained a lot from the attempt. So I'm a huge fan of the attempt, regardless of whether or not it ends up being a project that can ever be finished, a book that can be closed, et cetera. So yeah, that strikes me as hugely useful. And in fact, a sort of mapping of the incentive landscape of, if nothing else, even completely aside from something like Conjure, looking at the incentive landscape dynamics of the current technosphere, as well as just the current human social power dynamic spheres. Such maps don't really exist, or if they do, they tend to be held as private IP of various think tanks or intelligence agencies, right? To the extent that I speculate that these good quality maps actually exist. And so most of the ways that most of us are exposed to this are through lenses that come from various historians or political actors with obviously biased incentives of their own, right? The art of telling history is also partially the art of determining someone's current worldviews, right? It's very much a way in which you can subtly hack the incentive structure of someone else by feeding them a selective view on some set of historical events and power dynamics. And in fact, all such views have to be selective because the underlying territory is much too large to communicate verbally in an uncompressed way. So all of this is going to involve some lossy compression, right? So, but similarly to the way that software quality has gotten a lot better since the advent of open source, at least for the stuff that really matters, because we're no longer operating within, at least not totally within, the incentive landscape of the sort of game A economy, right? Because within that incentive landscape, it made no damn sense that Linux would have so much effort put into it. It took so long for it to become a saleable product in any sense. And even then, the people who put in all that effort, as we discussed earlier, were not the ones getting the economic returns from that. So it doesn't make any damn sense in the current paradigm, but it still happened, right? And so similarly, I think a sort of collective open source, minimally biased, or at least consciously biased compensating effort to do this sort of mapping of the dynamics you're discussing has great value. And I actually see a great resonance there with what, say, a Daniel Schmachtenberger and company are trying to do with the Consilience project. It seems to be very much a project perhaps of different or more limited scope, but along the same lines. So I'm curious how, if you see that connection too, and what your thoughts there are.
Yeah, well, Daniel and his project is kind of where I came up with this idea of mapping the incentive structures. Yeah, I had a thought and it's escaping me. In terms of sense making, and maybe this can bring us on to the next point. Where do you see mapping and actually being able to embody systems and being able to understand systems, and essentially my idea of conjuring hyperobjects? I just feel like there's a place we can go in terms of that and sense making as a collective. Is this a way that we can actually bring new paradigms, bring new reasoning, and actually showing people? So the social dilemma was a great thing in showing that, okay, you're actually, your psychology is being hacked, and this is an incentive structure. The advertising models and the data mining is actually using you to create money for the big platforms. So you're essentially working for Facebook when you go on there. You're training their algorithms.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so with what Daniel's doing, which I think is more of a new media paradigm, a new way of getting news out that's not disgusting as it is now. Is there a way that this can be applied to social interactions as well, and actually sense making and facilitating collective intelligence? Essentially is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I think so. So like, there's a lot of threads here. I'm going to try to tie a few of them together. So forgive me if that ends up not working as well as I hope it does. But I want to first bring in, something that I said in the trialogue I had recently on the Stoa with Forrest Landry and Bonita Roy, right? I drew attention to the fact that we were all kind of, this was all happening in real time. Like, we hadn't all actually spoken to each other, I think, ever really before then. We knew of each other perhaps, but, and then because it was the Jordan Hall Sense Maker in Residence session, but Jordan ended up not being able to make it, we started off sort of wrong-footed. And so this was very much like a spontaneous, extemporaneous, nobody had pre-planned remarks or ideas of what we were going to say in advance. So this was all happening sort of live and in the public sphere, whatever sense-making did or didn't occur there, right? And so I think that has an interesting resonance with both, say, open source as a movement and way of architecting things, as well as what Daniel is trying to do for the news media with the Consilience project. And this structure of these three things, what they have in common, can inform what you're talking about here, right? So open source, similarly, I can't think of something that's been a better resource to me as a programmer and engineer than getting to witness the discussions that happen in things like the Linux mailing lists, on GitHub projects, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you really get to see the areas, like it's always been important for me to notice the areas where smart people disagree, right? Like, don't tell me all the stuff that the smart people agree about, because I can go find that in a textbook. Show me where two different Nobel laureate physicists disagree about the interpretation of a given experimental result, for example, right? That's the juicy stuff. That's how you learn to do better sense making, is seeing those disagreements in public. And the less adversarially or rivalrously those disagreements can be had, the better, right? So now the Linux community in particular, due to the personality structures of some of the participants, doesn't always succeed at being non-adversarial or non-rivalrous in its communication style, but it does do pretty well at making the sense making and choice making of what ends up getting committed versus what doesn't, and what directions that project goes in, viewable to the public, to anybody who cares to go and investigate that. And if you do so, it will make you a better programmer, right? Same thing with the Consilience project. From what I've heard Daniel describe of this so far, it's critical that they don't pretend to be unbiased. They intend to show their biases, and you can drill down from their conclusions about a given world event and its significance to increasingly deeper layers, where there's less abstraction over the actual on-the-ground data, and you get eventually down to the real data sources and can draw your own conclusions with your own sense-making capabilities, right? So that complex of three things there suggests to me that doing sense making in public when you're not sure about what the sense is somewhere, like that is super valuable. And it's historically come at a social cost, because intellectuals and just more generally people don't like to seem to be uncertain. Confidence is sexy, right? Both, and to pretty much all genders. So to be seen as publicly unconfident is something that to some extent goes against our primate social wiring, right? And I think that that's one of the most powerful things that we could tweak about the current social incentive structures as a leverage point, is if we can just tweak that a little bit and begin to socially reward people, as well as perhaps financially or economically reward people for being publicly unconfident and still sharing their thoughts and reasons for having those thoughts. That gives us a sort of powerful bootstrapping ability to come to better sense making as individuals and as collectives, right? That's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, that seems like a nice summary for some places that we can maybe go in a future episode. What I'd like to do now is because I need to do some thinking on that.
No, totally understood. Yeah.
Yeah. So something else that we've been talking about a bit recently, that you're kind of heading up some efforts in, is the idea of bridging. It's essentially the idea of creating the conditions necessary to allow people to enter new paradigms of relating to the world. If you want to say some more on kind of the idea of bridges and Keegan's.
Yeah. So, I mean, as a brief intro, I'll just note that I did a session on the Stoa about this a couple weeks ago, just called The Bridge, that you can find on the Stoa YouTube channel. And there'll be a series happening there to do some deeper dives into some of this stuff in January, which is up on the Stoa website. So if people want to check that out to get more background, feel free to do so. But the essential idea is, at least for that first session, I focused on the paradigm of Keegan's stages of adult psychological development. It's a pretty well-researched and relatively data-supported model of adult human development, which itself can be kind of a controversial topic for certain culturally bound reasons, which I got into a bit in that session. I'm not going to get too deep into here. But the idea is that adult humans can go through a set of transitions between what Keegan calls stages, in which the relationship both to the self and to the social fabric or the social collective, as well as the way of meaning making or sense making or relating to the world as a whole, undergoes radical transformation. and that with this radical transformation comes some additional freedoms or allowances, right, affordances, because of the reframing of things that used to be seen as inherent parts of the subject now becoming objects available that don't say anything about yourself and can therefore be related to and manipulated, as opposed to just taken as givens about ourselves. So, and then in the bridge talk on the Stoa specifically, I focus on the transition from what Keegan describes as stage 4 to stage 5. Now, stage 4 is characteristic of systematicity is how he often puts it, rationality, fitting things into coherent, logically organized, and self-consistent systems. And this, of course, has its limitations, which is why there are stages beyond that. But Keegan, and then another explicator of Keegan's thought, David Chapman, whose blog Meaningness I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in meaning making and sense making. It's a wonderful resource. He explores the relationship of this to societies, noticing that we essentially live in a world which is built on structures that require a stage 4 systematic or rational understanding to really competently comprehend and interact with. So we can think of things like bureaucracies, large bureaucratic organizations that coordinate behavior of humans at far beyond the scale of the largest Dunbar number. We can think of the entire edifice of modern scientific and technological progress and education. We can think of modern medicine with all of its systematic diagnostics, flowcharts, rational ways of determining the state of a body and a relevant treatment as all the sort of things that meaningfully to do these things correctly require as a prerequisite some level of systematic stage 4 type of relating to the world. And David goes a bit further and points out that there used to exist several distinct bridges from stage 3, which is the sort of traditional communal mode of relating that human societies have had for thousands and thousands of years, to stage 4, which is the sort of modern, systematic mode of relating, which is capable of coordinating extremely large nation states, like things like the United States of America or Australia or the European Union, would simply fall apart without things like bureaucracy, systematic technological linkages, telecommunications networks, and so on. And so the majority of these bridges between 3 and 4 have fallen into disrepair, essentially, that they're no longer available to most people. And Chapman's assertion here is that essentially the only available bridge for many people these days is STEM education: science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine education, right? Because in order to get through an educational path like that, in order to succeed in that world, you have to be able to understand systematic ways of relating. You have to be able to understand systems and deal with them as objects, essentially. So that's a sort of a short summary, maybe not so short summary of that sort of paradigm for looking at things. And so I am quite interested in ways we can encourage technology, not just somebody that goes through a STEM bachelor's program, say, or a code boot camp, but really the way that we can encourage the users of given technological systems through social incentives and just the native ways of interacting with these technologies to develop into that stage 4 systematic mode of understanding. And you've actually kind of seen some progress or regress in the opposite direction, in that, so I'm right on the cusp of Gen X and the millennials and Xennial, if you will. I was born in 1985. So as I was growing up, computers were still things you primarily interacted with through a command line interface. And you often had to build your own and, deal with frequent crashes, blue screens, memory corruption errors, all this kind of wonderful stuff. You had to have some sense of how the computer actually worked in order to do anything on it. I remember being single digit number of years getting a new Star Wars game and having to deal with the fact that my PC couldn't run Windows and it at the same time, and creating some boot disks to load the game directly, that kind of thing, right? Which meant that I had to have some concept of what it meant to have a limited amount of RAM and ways that I might bypass that limitation and so on. Whereas now, it used to be a maxim that the younger generation was going to be more tech literate than the older generations. And there's been some research actually that shows that this has become less the case. Say you look at the Gen Z, the even the younger millennials and my generation, the say mid 80s generation, all grew up. If we had a computer, we grew up pretty familiar with a command line interface, at least in the sense of DOS, not as rich as Linux or Unix, but hey, it's a command line, and we had to deal with that. Most of us that got into having web pages or even MySpace pages, right, learned something about HTML just to be able to play obnoxious autoplay songs on your MySpace page and have garish backgrounds or whatever, right? And yet, due to the fact that the modern paradigm of touchscreens, mobile first type ways of interacting with technology that's been so thoroughly embraced by the younger adult generation, that level of tech literacy is not present there as much. And I think that's a kind of a worrying reversal of trend there. And so I'm interested in how, say, with something like Conjure, and we've touched on a few ideas that you've had along these lines already, but I'm really interested in your vision for like, how can Conjure and similar texts encourage people to go deeper into understanding the way they work? And how can it do so in a way that doesn't feel like a burden, but feels like an adventure of exploration for the user or participant?
Yeah. Well, this is one of a big passion of mine, going through the education system and struggling quite a lot because I was always focused on curiosity rather than meeting the requirements of, passing tests and all that sort of stuff. I've found that my natural curiosity is what has afforded me the ability to actually learn how to do web dev and all these sorts of things, and actually explore new paradigms as well. The actual worldview and meaning-making shifts, I think, require curiosity. It has to be an internal drive. And so facilitating curiosity and enhancing curiosity with a virtual layer is maybe one of the biggest long-term goals I have with Conjure, and I think the spatial web in general. I mean, what that looks like, you can look into specifics all day long. So talking about, having AI like Jarvis that from Iron Man who you can talk to and has the entire knowledge of the web, and even more so right there that you can just explore rather than having to Google on your phone. You can actually talk and have a back and forth.
I want to jump in on that and ask, are you familiar with The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson?
No.
It's a sci-fi novel. So one of the premises of this, it's set in a near future, slightly cyberpunk, but with nanotech as a heavy presence, right? And so one of the central objects in the novel is a book called The Young Lady's Illustrated Primer, which was designed by a megacorp for the daughter of that megacorp's founder, I believe, as a way to turn her into an educated and genteel lady, essentially. And so this is a nanotech book that rewrites its own pages, and on the back end has an AI system very similar to what you're describing that allows the child's own curiosity to guide them, but still has programmed into it some sense of, right relationship with things like social power structures, etiquette, authority, politeness, and so on. And now we could quibble with the particular ethical structures embodied by that book and that novel, right? But I think something like that is, frankly, the future of education. And I do see spatial platforms like Conjure as being a far more likely place for that to manifest than some, nanotech-based physical book artifact, right? It's more likely to be a virtual space that has a back end capable of that rather than any specific physical artifact. And so I think that's, just wanted to kind of double click on that notion because, yeah, that is it right there. That to me is the future of education, because I'm just like you. I barely got through school, right? And I didn't get through college because of this conflict between the structures and incentives of the authority figures there versus my own innate curiosity. And I really believe that every human has that innate curiosity, and unfortunately it's beaten or conditioned out of so many of us, but not completely. You can smother the spark but never fully extinguish it. And so I'm very interested in Conjure and platforms like it as a space where we could create these Now, I even hesitate to call it education, but learning play or something like that, right? Spaces that can really help nurture that spark of curiosity and creativity that every one of us has.
The dance of exploration.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I haven't got many more thoughts on what this actually looks like, because it is such a huge shift from the way that things have been, since the industrial age and before. I think the dialogical process that we're engaging in now is also quite necessary to explore. We definitely don't have that with text-based interfaces, and having high bandwidth connection between people, either in person or over the internet, seems to be necessary. And then the culture space of actually having the rule omega, rule alpha, where we are engaging in honest, deep, and just I don't know the words to describe it, but just high level, good and long lasting discussions on certain things, because that's how you get new ideas. It's how you explore your own ideas. Something I was talking with a friend was the idea of social processing of ideas, where actually for some things you just need to talk to someone, even if you're talking at them, but having that intersubjective, inter-emotional connection is enough to give you this new perspectives, new way of looking at information. And if we can facilitate that in virtual spaces, we can start to have the 7 billion people across the globe actually enter into this in a way that really only existed in institutions or lounge rooms earlier.
Yeah, and I think there's a real potential. So you sure you're familiar with the phrase rubber duck debugging, right? So, something in between that and this socialized sense making that you're talking about with the Jarvis style or Diamond Age style AI, right? I'm imagining now an AI trained on a corpus of conversations, like this one, and all of this other sense making conversations that are happening on the internet in recorded form today, and maybe even getting people who end up being particularly good at these sorts of conversations to contribute, to a corpus to train such an AI. Imagine taking something on the scale of whatever GPT-4 is going to look like and training it specifically as a tutor on a corpus of the best tutors available for every subject, and including sense making and the sort of meta level subjects, right? And then making that available for as close to free as we can manage it for people to just, engage. And, it would probably still be some sort of facsimile or simulacrum of Dialogos in the most genuine sense, but at least as a sort of, virtual training dojo for the real social sense-making Dialogos process. That seems like another really high leverage, really high value project that I hope somebody does.
Yep. This feels like a good place to end, I think. There's a lot here, and I think we may need to return to some ideas at a later stage, but I've really enjoyed this. You've given me a lot to think on, and
likewise, yeah, I've got some stuff to digest here too, and I'd love to have a follow-up conversation with you whenever we both have had a chance to marinate in this and come up with some more perspectives on it.
Fantastic. All right. It's been great chatting. I'll see you around, mate.
Likewise, always a pleasure.
See ya.